It is difficult not to marvel at the occurrence of mathematical structures which are seemingly found spread through nature, from the vastness of spiral galaxies to the fractal forms of tiny cellular life. That the language of mathematics can describe and model these structures is now well established and has led to some of the greatest scientific discoveries in modernity. Yet it's only a shift in philosophical position to contend that reality is not only describable in mathematical terms, but that reality is itself somehow fundamentally mathematical, a position forwarded most famously by Pythagoras, who contended that physis, or nature, was arithmos, or number, and of course extended by Plato, who held that geometry was the key to grasping the primeval structure of reality. Indeed, at the dawn of the new science, Galileo is said to have commented that mathematics is the alphabet with which God has written the universe. Such a sentiment would be shared by the pioneer of occult philosophy, Cornelius Agrippa. Indeed, Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia Libri 3 is probably the greatest summa, or systematic treatment of the philosophy of magic ever produced in Western philosophy, and it's in that second of three books that he will argue that mathematics is the bridge between the material world of physical substance and language, even the sacred and magically powerful Hebrew language, and the celestial world of the stars and their sublime astral power, all on the road to the spiritual realm and ultimately to divinity itself. In my previous episode on Agrippa, I took up his philosophy of language, and here, as a kind of sequel, I will turn to his theory of sacred number and mathematics. If you've not seen that first episode on his occult philosophy of language, you may want to take a look at it first to get more situated with what is going on in this episode. You can find a link to that one in the card above. Also, if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, or occult philosophy, make sure to subscribe to the channel, check out my numerous other videos on topics in esotericism, and also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics like this in esotericism and the academic study of the occult here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your considering supporting my work. But now, let's turn to Agrippa's second book of the occult philosophy, and to his theory and practice of the magic of mathematics. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Cornelius Agrippa's three books on occult philosophy is, as I mentioned a moment ago, the most systematic treatment of the philosophy of magic ever produced in Western philosophy. It provides a comprehensive treatment of the nature and function of magic as the wielding of hidden or occult forces in reality, all in the interest of the exaltation of the human soul back to its divine source. It's both a textbook of magical practice, but also of Renaissance Hermetic spirituality, which sought to reunify the soul of the practitioner with its divine source. The text itself is divided into three books which treat the occult substructure of the natural world, the celestial world of astral forces, and finally the spiritual world, all of which seeks to move ever upward to the divine source from which being emerges, into which it aspires. Toward the end of Book 1, Agrippa turns his attention to the non-physical world, especially the world of the mind, of the soul, and of language, especially the occult power of language in the theory and practice of magic. There he argues that language has a unique ability to powerfully bridge the physical and non-physical worlds, especially sacred languages such as Hebrew, and especially magical symbols. Again, for more details on this, make sure to check out my episode on Agrippa's theory of the occult power of language. However, it's in his second book that Agrippa continues his movement toward the divine by turning to a dimension of reality more formal than even language, the reality of mathematics and its occult powers. He begins by pointing out that mathematics is so necessary to the theory and practice of magic that any attempt to do so without it is simply in vain. It will simply be frustrated. One is reminded of the plaque above Plato's Academy, which warned that no one without expertise in geometry should even enter at all. Why such a focus for Agrippa? The answer is quite simply that when the divine being created all of being, it was done so using both sacred spoken language, reality was created through speech, but structured in a fundamentally mathematical manner. Here, Agrippa is taking Galileo at his word. The structure of being is fundamentally mathematical. Thus, there can be no magical theory or practice without an in-depth understanding of just what this mathematical structure is. Of course, this conception is far from new or actually unique to Agrippa, but what he does is set this notion as the very lever, along with language, at the transition from the physical world to the celestial and divine worlds. Sacred language and mathematics are the bridge between the realms. Thus, any theory and practice of magic which seeks to capture and control the flow of occult power through these realms must, basically by definition, deeply grasp both the exoteric and esoteric, especially the esoteric or occult reality of both sacred language and mathematics. In the early chapters of Book 2, Agrippa discusses how physical nature expresses this underlying mathematical reality. Of course, by grasping the mathematics of nature, one can, for instance, employ the power of geometry for engineering, or manipulate light as it passes through lenses to extend sight, or focus it into a kind of laser to make fire. However, he quickly introduces a distinction between natural and the more formal mathematics. These purely formal numbers and mathematical operations are the principal pattern, as he puts it, found in the very divine mind, by which being itself emerged and was structured. Thus, it is incumbent on the magus to grasp the esoteric dimensions of both numbers and mathematical relations. Thus, number, like sacred language, is held to be metaphysically powerful, encoded with nothing less than divine thought itself. Of course, like language, not just any vulgar language will do here. Agrippa leans heavily in these early sections on the bombastic genius of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola to separate off what the latter calls the distinction between the mere numbers of the merchants and the pure divine formal mathematics of magic and prophecy, as he lays it out in his famed 900 Theses. Indeed, Agrippa follows Pico by arguing that the mechanical geometry is still too informal to reach to the divine, and that the power of prophecy, such as that of the famous prophet Joachim of Fior, can only be achieved through this purer formal mathematics. Thus, following Pico, Agrippa describes the formal use of both numbers specifically and mathematics more generally in strictly philosophical and spiritual terms. This is a genuine occult philosophy of mathematics where numerology, secular and sacred geometry, and arithmetic intersect. Agrippa begins his philosophical discussion by introducing his occult concept of number as a repetition of unity, thus unity being an extension of the fundamental unity of divinity itself. Thus, mathematical and metaphysical unity are formally coextensive. Here, Agrippa's hyper-realist philosophy of language is matched, unsurprisingly, with a similar hyper-realist philosophy of mathematics. This fundamental unity is both the origin and final destination of all being and is expressed at every register of reality, including physical reality, with the singular substance by which all physical substance comes to be. You guessed it, it's the philosopher's stone of the alchemists. In the dozen-plus chapters that follow, Agrippa proceeds number by number from the first element of division into 2 to the 72-letter most holy name of God and beyond. These chapters are a tour de force of Agrippa's genius at harvesting numerical references from the vast wealth of sacred and secular literature. From Hesiod and the Gospels, from pagan myth to Kabbalistic speculation, from Greek philosophy to scholasticism, literature, natural philosophy to astrology, and even divisions within the animal kingdom. Obviously, summarizing them here is basically impossible, so you'll need to turn to these sections in Agrippa's second book if you want to study these vast systems of numerical correspondences for yourself. Indeed, these chapters, and especially the vast system of correspondence tables contained in each chapter, form the core of the numerological occult system at the heart of modern Western esotericism. I can't stress enough just how important these tables are in Book 2 in the history, theory, and practice of modern magic. And yes, that's magic with a K, just so you know. Now, that's not to say there aren't problems with these sections. The Hebrew text, as far back as the original 1533 edition, is rife with defective spellings, especially in the Hebrew numbers and things like that. And subsequent editions do as much to make the situation worse by correcting them. Also, some of the mathematics found in these sections isn't exactly, well, it's not as exact as you might hope, given that it's, math. But regardless, these tables are in some form still being reproduced today, from Aleister Crowley's Liber 777 to Dr. Skinner's 5th edition of the famed Magician Tables. Following this systematic and, for the time, rather exhaustive number-by-number exposition, Agrippa then turns to a discussion of the various expressions such numerals can take, from physical human gestures, of course these are important in the practice of ritual magic, to the systems of the Romans, Greeks, and ancient Israelites, along with a interestingly specific astrological numerical system. Curiously though, the Arabic numerals aren't discussed really at all, but they do appear in the text, although in a really mysterious manner. There's an illustration at the end of the section on the proportionality of the human being, labeled with Arabic numerals that have puzzled scholars for quite some time. I'm still not quite sure what they mean, and I've asked several scholars and no one seems to have an idea at all. If you have any guesses, feel free to put them in the comments below. Of course, this system of numerals was introduced by Fibonacci in the 13th century in his Liber Abaci as the modus indorum. After establishing the esoteric dimensions of the numerals and their various modes of representation, Agrippa then shifts his attention to the true topic of discussion in Book 2, the celestial world and the astral powers more generally, though Agrippa does explore a few other elements along the way. Of course, it's long been recognized that the celestial world proceeds in a fundamentally mathematical manner. This was known all the way back to the ancient Babylonians, though especially given the geocentric commitments of his time, This resulted in an increasingly complex series of calculations of epicyclical movement, mathematically complex, yes, mathematically elegant, no. However, Agrippa doesn't venture into such problems, and Copernicus' De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium wouldn't even appear until 1543, a decade after the publication of the 3 books of occult philosophy. In this regard, the text remains fundamentally medieval and thus geocentric in its worldview. Indeed, it's in these sections of Book 2 that Agrippa's magic also appears the most, well, medieval. Here we find a variant of the more famous and perhaps more infamous medieval astral magic inherited from the Picatrix and folks like Al-Kindi. We also find some scholastic elements of astral necromancy and the more naturalized, one might say sanitized, form of Neoplatonic celestial magic developed by Ficino. Agrippa first connects the formal occult mathematics of the first half of Book 2 with the second half and celestial magic more generally by establishing a classic set of correspondences between the various numerals, the celestial bodies, and their sympathetic and antipathic relationships, some of which we've actually already seen in those vast correspondence tables back in the middle sections of Book 2 already. The reader is then provided the pretty famous collection of magical squares and seals of the celestial bodies. Now, just how these magical tables and their accompanying magical symbols are produced is the subject of not a little speculation, but such tables and symbols are attested in various forms as far back as the late classical world, showing a great deal of continuity between late classical, Arabic, scholastic, and Renaissance magic. In general, at least, it seems that Agrippa imagines these tables as fundamentally Kabbalistic in nature. They're all written out with Hebrew letters and numbers, and formed by tracing numerical values of Hebrew names and words, though this is by no means explanatory of all the magical symbols, and even the mathematical values of some of these tables seemed corrupt from time to time. This corruption of Hebrew words and names is rather endemic in Agrippa, and really it's just a problem in all early modern printing by non-Jews generally, and it seems to only get worse by those that borrow, correct, or just straightforwardly plagiarize these writers over the centuries. These magical squares and symbols have had a massive impact on the occult tradition and continue to inspire the construction of magical symbols in contemporary magical practices. Again, the decisive importance of these sections in a Book 2 cannot really be overstated. Finally, Agrippa makes a few brief forays into sacred geometry, celestial and musical harmonics, and the mathematical and celestial harmony of the human body itself. These sections are surprisingly brief, but they are positively packed with information. We learn, for instance, just why the pentacle has such power over demons. It's the power of the number 5, especially in the relationship between the 5 triangles, the acute and obtuse angles, the central pentagon that actually does the trick. It's the power of 5. Along with what might be a reference to a early kind of telescope, or perhaps a magical remote viewing device, or both. It is Agrippa after all. He then lays out his theory of the occult power of music, specifically how certain harmonic structures here, inherited from Pythagorean and Platonic theories of music, relate to and express the celestial effect upon our own world and everything from animals to our own emotional and psychical states. In all likelihood, this is again coming into his system by way of Marsilio Ficino, for whom just such a theory of music was central in his mystical theology. Of course, such theories have gone on to be implemented in a range of occult musical practices, from neo-Baroque music inspired by Ficino's philosophy and the Orphic hymns, to stadiums packed with folks to listen to the Fibonacci sequence set to Platonic lyrics by Tool. Before turning fully to the second section of Book 2, Agrippa establishes the final and most important bridge between the natural and celestial worlds. Us. Human beings are the nexus of the worlds in which we contain a body which expresses a fundamental mathematical harmony, which in turn receives celestial power, which the mind and soul can magically transform in the ascent towards that fundamental divine unity that began our very discussion. For Agrippa, like many Renaissance humanists, the human being is the most sublime of all creatures because it is made in the very image of the divine and can thus reach back to that divine status. Thus, the proportions and harmonies of the physical body, the mental world, and the spiritual reality of the human being reflect, capture, refract, and seek out that primal divine reality from which all of us are said to have emerged. The images of these sections are something reminiscent of the famed Vitruvian Man sketched out by Da Vinci, though both sets of these images may actually have their ultimate origins in finding just such harmonies and proportions by many artists, philosophers, theologians, and magicians of the time. Though there's a darker side to this idea of physical harmonics as well, that those lacking it, those physically not beautiful, may be metaphysically suspect, a rather unfortunate consequence of an otherwise lovely concept. Of course, this physical harmony or proportions is also more perfectly mirrored in both the mind and the soul. Indeed, for Agrippa, it is only by assenting one's will to the beneficence which emanates down from the divine world through the celestial world that one's will can truly be said to be free at all. And it's by freeing one's will from baser, merely physical urges and turning one's spiritual and mental attentions toward one's striving toward the celestial and to the divine realms that one can truly said to be wholly realized, made wholly real in one's fundamental being through returning to the primal unity of the divine itself. With all of this in mind, Agrippa then begins his discussion of the celestial or astral magic in earnest. That'll have to be a topic for a future episode, I'm sure. Agrippa's second book of occult philosophy marks the transition to the world of celestial power by extending his discussion of magical language to the magical power of mathematics itself. These 29 chapters, the lion's share really of Book 2, detail this occult theory of mathematics, but also covers a range of topics, as I've mentioned, much of which, almost all of which, has become staples in the theory and practice of magic and the occult more generally over the centuries. Thus, both for practitioners of the Western mysteries and for those just interested in Neoplatonic philosophy of the later Renaissance, this section of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy is simply indispensable and well worth a very, very careful study. I've included some book recommendations on Agrippa in my general introduction to his life and works if you want to check that out in the card above. I've also put those links in the description below if you want to take a look at some of those studies of Agrippa's thought. I'm sure, beyond doubt, that I'll be covering all of the 3 books at some point in some degree of detail, so make sure to stay tuned for those episodes. Finally, I'd really like to thank Eric Perdue for giving me a sneak peek into his upcoming new translation of Agrippa's 3 books. I'm really hoping to look at both new translations sometime this fall or winter and hopefully compare them in an upcoming episode. Agrippa, as you may know, was infamous for his mastery of Latin. In his youth, he was said to only converse with people in Latin because he was a jackass. And I'm looking forward to seeing these new translations. I'm really excited that we can get beyond the freak translation, although I'm going to be sad to not be able to say freak translation any longer. Again, if you're interested in topics like this, make sure to subscribe, check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism, and again, I'd hope you consider supporting my work of making content like this that's both scholarly and freely accessible here on YouTube for free. I hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can check those links out below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.